Greetings, folks. You're listening to the Paranormal Peep Show on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. My name's Andy Chaplin, and joining me is Neil Geddes-Ward. Neil, how are you doing?
Hello, Andy. Well, I'm fine, thank you. And it's nice to be here once again for the Paranormal Peep Show. We've obviously been doing this for quite a while now. We've had lots of interesting guests, all from different corners of the paranormal world, haven't we? With UFOs and ghost researchers and things like that. But yeah, I mean, what's your take on it all so far? I mean, where do you think we're? Do you think we're kind of coming up to any solid proof of anything happening, or are we just grasping in the dark on these things?
Well, I think by the very nature of this kind of thing, it's very difficult to get solid proof. I mean, there's two sides to it as well, because something that we might regard as proof, Neil, me and you, by somebody of a scientific nature would be put down to anecdotal, and so they would say, oh, it's not proof at all because blah 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 blah. So I think proof is very much kind of like a subjective thing to each individual, really. I mean, mediums, when we go on stage or when we're doing our work, have to say that it's for entertainment purposes only, and it's not scientifically proven. I would say not scientifically proven to whoever created that stipulation. It is proven to me because I've encountered it, and no doubt you've encountered it too, Neil, and most of our guests as well. So when mediums have to say that, it's really just to kind of like tick the box for some bureaucrat in Brussels, essentially. The EU, which is one of my favourite subjects.
Somewhere in Brexit land, yeah.
Yeah. So when it gets out of the EU, I'll be very happy. The EU can go and stuff itself, as far as I'm concerned.
Have you ever taken part in any official tests, scientific tests on mediumship or ESP or anything like that?
Only insofar as I've been on ghost hunts in various kind of haunted locations and had scientific teams with me, and by scientific teams I mean very amateur, very low level, so they've got their instruments and they've got their gauges and they've got their various things that, you know, I mean, that's a whole different contention in itself, you know, contentious issue in itself, you know, whether the instruments such as EVP and EMF meters going off, whether that constitutes an actual spirit at all. You know, some people say yes, that absolutely does, and it's proof of paranormal. Some people just say no, it's just, you know, natural electromagnetic waves in the vicinity. So I haven't done anything in terms of sitting in a like a studio, so to speak, or like a clinical laboratory and being tested in that way. I don't want to jump through hoops. I'm here to kind of do what I do and enjoy it, not to jump through hoops. You know, trying to massage someone else's ego, who usually, I would say, usually have an agenda to disprove it. So you will often come across people, I won't name them, but some fairly famous kind of like scientific types and skeptical types, who will say, oh, I'd love it to be proven to me. I'd love it to be real. If only it could be proven to me. And then they'll conduct their tests, but they'll have an agenda behind it to absolutely disprove it.
Interesting. Okay, well, we're going to introduce tonight's guest, and we can find out whether he's done tests on this kind of thing. He's also written a book called Phone Calls from the Dead. Whether he's got an agenda or not, we'll have to find out. So we'd just like to present tonight's guest, and that's Cal Cooper. Cal, welcome to the show.
Hello, Cal.
Hi, guys. Hello, how are you doing?
We're fine, thank you, and thanks for joining us. So, Cal, before we obviously proceed into hopefully a lengthy, interesting conversation, can you give us a little bit about your background? Who are you? We know who you are, but for our listeners' benefit, who are you, and how did you get into the kind of research that you're doing? Because you're a psychologist initially, aren't you?
Yeah, so I'm, for those of you that don't know me, I'm Dr. Cal Cooper. I'm from the University of Northampton in the psychology division there. Based there as a lecturer and researcher, and I'm involved in a number of areas of research within psychology, positive psychology, human sexual behaviour, death, dying and bereavement, and most notably for me, parapsychology as well. And we explore a variety of different areas of psychology because we offer undergraduate degrees in psychology through to specialist master's programs, and take on a variety of research degrees as well, so certain doctorates and masters of philosophy. And we get a fair few people as well coming specifically because of parapsychology, wanting to do the own independent research on that, either because of things they've read or experiences they've had, and they want to actually know more through conducting official research. You've asked, how did I get into this? Well, that's a really long story that could probably take up the whole show. So in brief summary, I come from Nottinghamshire. I commute to Northampton to get into the university. And I just loved Nottingham, even though I'm more familiar with Northampton's town centre. But Nottingham's history has always fascinated me in growing up. I used to go to the local library, and it was something that we used to do as part of school every week. I think it was like a Tuesday afternoon or something like that. And we'd walk to the local library. And it was at the time when more and more libraries per county and per town would have their own sort of heritage shop attached to it, where they would hold a lot of the local history files and newspapers, and then postcards that you could buy or books on the local history. And with that, you would quite often find that local writers, amateur writers, had collected together people's experiences of hauntings and ghosts. And so I suppose the local writer for me in Sutton in Ashfield was Jane Peters. She produced these very basic booklets where they got laminated front covers, and people had done beautiful pencil drawings to illustrate some of the experiences. And all the booklet was just purely, this is a bit of the history of Sutton in Ashfield and Kirkby in Ashfield and the Mansfield area. And these are the experiences people have had, either through it being sent in to Jane, or she went out to interview these people. And I think I've found that really quite fascinating, because I used to go straight away to the paranormal section in the library with friends, and we'd look at these books and just get really fascinated by different cases. And amongst those books were even ones on Fortean phenomena, so things about UFOs, the Loch Ness Monster, Bigfoot. But that was also my kind of path into being interested in the ghost hunter of the 1930s, Harry Price, because there were some cases of Jeff the Talking Mongoose, which he investigated on the Isle of Man. But I was also fascinated with his most famous haunting case, which was Borley Rectory. So that was, to cut a long story short, my path into it. When it came to selecting universities, when I wanted to go and do an undergraduate degree, I looked at various different universities up and down the UK, but specifically those where they had a taught module within the syllabus of either exceptional human experiences, anomalistic psychology, or parapsychology, all essentially the same thing, looking at the psychology behind why people seem to have these experiences and whether something else is going on that doesn't fit current scientific paradigms. And I eventually settled for the University of Northampton, did my degree, went away, did a master's, went back again, did my PhD, and during that time I got a teaching post. So here I am now. I got the dead man's boots position, but I'm module coordinator for third year parapsychology at the moment. And as I say, teaching on all of these different areas of death, dying, bereavement, sexual behaviour, positive psychology, and social science research methods.
So Cal, I mean, we've got to start from the basics, really. Have you had any kind of like paranormal or psychic experiences yourself?
To be political about that, I think whenever you kind of ask a group of people and go through all the various kinds of experiences they could relate to, you'll find that it's very hard to find someone that hasn't had any of these experiences. So
any that jump out as kind of like, whoa, that is proper freaky, as opposed to, that's a bit strange.
For me personally, or with where I was going with this?
Because it would be interesting to see kind of like where your perspective is on this. Because I think we had, Neil, do you remember we had Kieran O'Keefe at one point? I don't know if you were in on that one.
Yeah.
That's and now that wasn't the Peep show, but that was probably our sister show, the Paranormal UK Radio Network. Yeah,
that's it. And we asked him the same question, and he said, generally speaking, no. But there was a couple of instances that he had where that he couldn't explain. Even he was kind of like at a loss to explain.
Yeah, Kieran's had a few people like Richard Wiseman. I know that off record he has, on record he hasn't. And
that's interesting. I didn't know that.
Well, I think we have to be careful in a way. Otherwise, from wider criticism and often pseudo-skepticism, we then get criticised for then admitting that we can relate to the experience because we've encountered something along the way, you know, probably many years into the research and the work that we're doing that can't be seemingly explained at first glance. I mean, the only one I can relate to that was the weirdest was Paisley Vale Mills. I was in there with some police officers, and at times the place had had reports of potential attempted break-ins, but with all the doors and windows seemingly absolutely fine, no obvious kind of evidence of a forced break-in or anything like that, but it was things being moved around.
Were the police officers there in a context of doing their work, or as a kind of like a, not exactly a sleepover, but a haunted investigation?
It had varied from call-outs, official call-outs, to in their own time actually going to actually find out what was going on, and through like knowing people as well. But I was up there with a couple of them on the fourth floor when we kind of picked up some piece of rubble. I mean, if you picture this room, it was like a massive old cotton mill. So the ceilings, you know, are a good 12 foot high, maybe even more, with all these massive pillars supporting the ceiling. And part of the floor had given way in the middle. So there was wooden floorboards, and then in the middle were these metal sheets protecting the floor and the drop. And we picked up some piece of rubble and threw them off to the end of the room. And there's only one door in, and that same door leads you out as well. There's no other way of getting in. And you could see straight across the room. There was loads of spotlights outside, even though there's these massive windows from ceiling to almost floor. There's about 3 foot of brickwork below the windows. And in throwing these pieces of rubble off, I think one of them said, you know, if there's someone out there, could you throw something back? And there was this bang, and a piece of rubble came across, skimmed across the floor in the same way it had gone out. And we caught this on camera. The weird thing was, to pick it up, it was very hot after, you know, finding it rolling all the way up towards our feet and then just reaching out and picking it up. So that was a really weird one, but that came after probably about 4 or 5 years of me having been sent to different haunted locations to check it out, from different call-outs through the university, to these people saying, would you come and check it out, and kind of be an independent observer. And, you know, I'd read all kinds of texts on research that had been done into poltergeist phenomena, and all it did for me was, one, make my heart sink at the time, thinking, that's strange. It's not fallen from the ceiling. It doesn't work like that. Rubble doesn't fall across the room and travel 40 yards or so. It's come back in the same way we skimmed it off. And it just matched previous accounts. So I thought, well, okay, there's something to these documented accounts. But what was actually going on there beyond that, I don't know. All I can say is that's what we saw, that's what was reported, and that is what was filmed.
Do you find that you're... Sorry, Andy, go on.
I was going to say, so in this particular location, had anyone actually seen any apparitions? Because that's kind of evidence that is personal to yourself, but not necessarily. Well, I suppose it could be kind of like a poltergeist or a spirit. But how did you or anyone else see anything in terms of like a shadow or full body apparition of any kind?
No, I've never seen a ghost. I'd like to, if you know, such things are occurring in the way that they're reported. But I think it was only on some of the upper floor corridors that people had allegedly seen various apparitions, or one particular one walking around. Not in this room. This is where all the looms used to be housed. So yeah, not in that particular room.
Do you find, Cal, that you know, you kind of research it as best as you can, but then you just come up a kind of a wall of the science just can't get to that stage to explain it, and really there is some phenomena, but because you can't explain it, you just have to kind of like forget it, or not forget it, but what's the word? You write it down and just hope science of the future can explain it. Is that where it's going?
Well, I think that's the same for any area of science that's kind of got uncharted territory. You need to observe and document and then see where it takes you. And that can be from a number of different ways. You could be surveying hundreds of thousands of people via a very kind of numbers-based study, which we call quantitative, or doing interviews with people and looking at their accounts and doing a qualitative analysis of what are the characteristics of these experiences. It's only by doing that and keep on doing that, if you keep on doing that, you'll have a good database that you'll probably learn from. Another route that we're taking at the moment is a neuroscience approach as well, where we're testing mediums at the Arthur Findlay College and looking at their brainwave activity to see if during certain tasks there is a difference in their brainwave activity compared to other people as well. But, you know, you could compare it to other sciences. Look at cancer research, for example. Just because they don't have an answer, you know, they're not going to give up. You will reach barriers and say, well, this drug that we've attempted to create to get rid of prostate cancer in this particular instance, it works for 80% of the males that we give it to, but not for the other 20%. So what's going on there? It seems to be doing the job, but there are some anomalies here where it doesn't seem to affect other people. So what's the difference in the types of cancer that they're actually suffering from? It's a route that we will just constantly be pushing forward with. I mean, that's a healthcare example, but we're looking at the social sciences here, which has some overlaps with physics and a few other things. Parapsychology seems to branch out to a number of different things. But even though we've kind of reached an inconclusive answer on different things, it won't stop us moving forward. We've got a lot of good evidence to suggest that if we're going by social science research methods and if we trust the science of statistics, then it says that something's going on. And if that's the case, then we need to understand why and dig a bit deeper. So I think neuroscience is really a next step in shedding some light on that. I think a lot of people forget that a lot of the methods that other sciences are working from, especially medical science, when it comes to drug trials and using statistics, that is all developed from parapsychology. Because in the 1920s and 30s, it got a lot of criticism for its field research and lab research, with people saying it's not scientific, it's all observation and documentation. That's then to the researcher's interpretation of the phenomena. If you want to get accepted by the wider sciences, use a method that's scientific. So statistical science was in its infancy at the time, and J.B. Rhine and his wife Louisa Rhine wanted to harness the statisticians at Duke University. So they came in. That was the start of the Zener test with the star, the cross, the wavy line, the circle, the square. And it was a very simple procedure that had a very clear method, and was showing that in many cases when they got exceptional subjects, just day-to-day members of staff or students at the university, there are some people within the population that do better at ESP studies than others, and they will get far beyond what chance would expect, phenomenally so in some instances. And
just to interject, I actually did an ESP session because I sometimes do little workshops at one of Neil's groups, funnily enough, and there's a friend of mine who's highly psychic. Now the original kind of like psi cards, there were about 5 cards, weren't they, in the 1920s? I actually created my own cards, and I created 10 symbols, and she actually got it right 100%. There was 10 lots, there was 10 waves of kind of like doing this, so there was a 1 in 10 chance, and she got it 10 times in a row, and we worked it out to be something like a 1 in a trillion chance of that happening. It was bizarre. So if there's anyone to test, it will be her.
I'd love to see the cards that you developed, actually see them in person, and then also see this person do it again. I mean, they realised that, but just having 5 simple symbols, it was easy enough for people to remember. But sometimes they would lay them out in front of them as well. But there you've got your 1 in 5 chance. So in a pack of 25, 5 out of 25 will be your chance level. Allowing for 1 deviation from chance as well. So 6 out of 25 is about average. But when you were doing these as home tests, at the very least, you'd expect someone to go through it 100 times over. So you could get any kind of meaningful statistical outcome from it. But these people at Duke University were doing it thousands of times over, just because it was a very simple task. But to that point on, where are we? Have we reached an end point? Those studies, set the groundwork, which many other areas of science adopted. And those areas of sciences come under less criticism than parapsychology do. And yet parapsychology, when you look at its methods, are far stronger than most other sciences because of the very claims that it's trying to test.
So why is the skeptics out to kind of nullify any kind of research into the paranormal? It's all we hear all the time. There's no such proof or no such thing as the paranormal, no such thing as ghosts. All mediums are frauds, etc., etc. And even the official line of the media or the society or whatever goes along with that kind of general framework of thinking, despite the fact that there's people like yourself doing this research into it, and there's lots of people that are having genuine experiences. It's just that society doesn't want to accept it, or official society. Why is that?
Well, with the very statements that you've made, there's no such thing as ghosts, no one's experienced them, there's no such thing as people being psychic. People making those statements are not skeptics. I would say they're pseudo-skeptics. I'm a skeptic. I'm a scientist. I look at the evidence. I know all the fors. I know the against. I know where to find them. I'm not saying I know every bit of literature, but I know where to find them. All of my research report shows a balance of cases that are found for and cases that are found against, and the arguments. So I'm data driven. I will go on what the evidence is saying per study. People that make the claim that none of this is happening, that's very kind of ill-informed pseudo-skepticism. It's saying I'm a skeptic, but none of this is going on. Well, that's nonsense. If you've actually bothered to read the literature, you'll know that it is going on. To say that people don't experience ghosts is absolute nonsense. People absolutely do. They've been doing it for thousands of years. Whether there's such thing as a ghost, as in independent survival of the mind beyond death, is a different matter completely. And that's highly debatable. It will send you off into all kinds of debates. But saying whether people do or don't claim these experiences, it's very much yes, they do. What they are is a different matter.
Where would you send people in terms of the literature, if there's anyone listening to this that would like to delve into the evidence of it?
Well, there's. I'll come back to the media point as well. I'll just make a note of that. When it comes to the literature, there's various different places you could go to. I mean, you could go online and look up the Parapsychology Foundation, the Ryan Research Centre, or if you want something a bit closer to home, if you're based in the UK, certainly the Society for Psychical Research. So with that, you could go to www.spr.ac.uk. Where if you live in London, you can walk into their library during the week. It's open most days, and go and look at their library collection, where it houses various doctoral theses through to books and various journals. And they produce their own journal and proceedings every quarter as well, which is peer reviewed. But they're looking to my library behind me right now. There's various texts from the Journal of Parapsychology to the European Journal of Parapsychology, the Australian Journal of Parapsychology, the Journal of the Society for Psychical Research, the Journal of the American Society for Psychical Research. And then of times gone by, there was the Journal of Paraphysics, the Indian Journal of Parapsychology, the South African Journal of Parapsychology. It goes on. I mean, to say none of that exists, I mean, I could be here again for another hour just listing everything that's surrounding me right now, that people say that there's none of that. I remember one time being at a house party and someone saying, "Oh, what do you do for a living?" And I've often been very careful with what I say in response. If I'm up for a debate or a conversation, I'll say I'm involved in parapsychology. I'm a parapsychologist. If I don't want the debate, I'll just say I'm a psychologist, and it kind of cuts it short and no one's really interested. Or they just say, "Oh, you must be psychic then. You're reading me right now." And then I have to explain that being a psychologist has nothing to do with being a psychic. But at this one particular house party, I said I'm a parapsychologist, and the person said, "Isn't that ghosts and psychic phenomena and all that?" And I said, "Well, in a way, yes, it's looking at why people have these experiences and the science behind what's going on there." And they said, "Well, that's rubbish. There's no evidence for that." And I said, "Well, I'm sorry to burst your bubble, but there's a lot of literature on that, studies that are found for and against, and it goes back a long way. And it's still going on very much to this day because we haven't really got concrete answers to different things. Same for a lot of other sciences." And they still said, "It's all nonsense, mate. There isn't any of that evidence. I don't know why you're telling me there is." And I said, "Well, you're more than welcome to come to the university. I'll buy you a coffee and some lunch, and I'll show you around. And, you know, I can leave you in the library with a cup of coffee, and you're free to browse our archives and all the journals." And he got so annoyed at that response and left.
I wonder why that is. What do you think is going on in his head?
Because he didn't like the coffee.
Probably. But you know, if you've been brought up with a certain mindset because of your parents or your education or also your friends, and you're told that you know, all ghosts and psychics and so forth, it's all a load of nonsense, it's just out to entertain, and you really have been shied away from these various organizations that have been going for well over 100 years now, it's damaging in a way. I suppose it would really kind of hurt the way that you actually see the world, unless you're prepared to actually you know, open up and say, "You know what, I've been led to believe this, and actually I've just discovered there's a whole world here that of literature and research that I wasn't aware of." But for some people, it really goes against the grain and hurts. And you can look at this in the same light of what you mentioned, Neil, with the media. And as far as I've seen, the media have really suppressed a fair balance of what's actually going on with regard to the testing, the evidence out there. There've been some good shows in the past, but we're talking like early 90s. Nowadays, it's very, very misleading. I've got a few friends in the media, even some that know people like Darren Brown, and I love Darren Brown's stuff. It's really interesting. More so his early stuff I was interested in. But I just wonder, what really are his thoughts? Because he does like the literature on spiritualism, but the way he portrays it is very false and misleading, saying, there was never any evidence for any of this, or it was all fraud going on, or it's not good that people go to see mediums because it's very damaging to the bereavement process. I've done that main research on the bereavement process and going to see mediums. And as far as I can tell, there is hardly any evidence whatsoever to show that it damages the bereavement process. If anything, it supports it. There's a few minority cases where people take negatives from it, but we're only just starting to research that just to find out what actually happens in those cases, because we're talking like 2%, if that. So the media has always had this personal vendetta of suppressing what's going on. I don't know if because they feel that it's going to cause a lot of complaints and some sort of moral panic, because I think there'll be a majority view of people saying, this goes against my worldviews and the grains. Science isn't interested in these kinds of things. It's not going on. So don't you dare tell me otherwise. It's just easier to present it in that light, this very hardened skeptical view, which I find quite insulting as a skeptic, because it's presented in just on the fringe of being pseudo-skeptical, where it's denying the evidence that's out there and only presenting one side of the argument.
Very well put. I've always had this, argument in figurative terms with the media, and I mentioned it before on this show, and Andy's aware of it. For instance, we used to get programs like Stars on Sunday, Songs of Praise, all these various religious programs, and it would say tonight's program is from the Cathedral of wherever, with the Right Honourable Reverend so-and-so, and you listen to all the prayers they talk about, they do all their songs, and it's all basically God worshipping stuff, religious Christianity, that kind of stuff. And yet when you get a Tony Stockwell medium, a Colin Fry medium, or in the older days it was Doris Stokes, they'd be on TV and they would say, as Andy said earlier, has to be classed as pure entertainment. Nothing could be construed from what you're about to see. It's not real. They're implying it's not real. It's just construed as entertainment, blah, 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 blah. And yet, the mediums, in my opinion, were bringing through much more evidence for an afterlife than any of the religious programs ever could, basically, because it's all they're just reading out of a book, basically, talking about something that happened 2,000 years ago, plus going beyond that, whereas the mediums are bringing through things that are more pertinent. They're bringing through loved ones, friends, things like that, and they're providing, I think they're providing not necessarily proof, but evidence of survival, whereas the churches don't do that. And yet the mediums are constrained by this television rule or radio rule, media broadcasting rule, that they have to say that it's purely for entertainment purposes only. Now, if they said about Jesus and the God stuff that it's purely for entertainment purposes only, then I'll be happy, because then it's a level playing field. But it's a very unlevel playing field, and that's what really annoys me. It sounds like it annoys you as well.
I've never heard it put in that way, but I see where you're getting at now. You mentioned that. I do wonder what the backlash would be if they said, and now it's time for Songs of Praise, and then this warning came up saying, this is purely for entertainment purposes only.
They should do it with glove puppets. That would be entertaining.
It would be interesting to see, but I totally get where you're coming from. It's a shame that I guess no program would really be interested in it, but out of all the different journals I look at, I am interested. I'm not a religious person myself, but I'm interested in the theological take on psychical phenomena as well. So I certainly subscribe to the Christian parapsychologists to look at their takes. And it is interesting when you go into any religious text, really, and go back, a few thousand years. And I've even looked at this with ancient Egypt. But if you strip away all the religious interpretation from these experiences and events, the phenomenology of psychic encounters, ghostly experiences, still remains the same worldwide. So we've got these absolutely crystal clear cross-cultural comparisons. And yet it's just the kind of religion that you're involved with, or the culture that you come from, that just adds a little bit of a spin on what these things actually mean or how they're reported. So I find it fascinating from that sense. So I found that religion has had some contributions to make. I don't agree with people that say that religion has no place whatsoever in science. It certainly doesn't when it comes to your own personal beliefs. But in terms of how you can harness the text to understand the development of human interaction, morals, and how people have reported things over time, I certainly think there are some things that we can actually gain from using the text to say, well, how have things changed? That they have got their uses.
The actual for entertainment purposes only thing, I think, came in around about the mid 2000s. It was around about 2005-ish, if I remember rightly.
I can't remember specifically going right back to the Doris Stokes years when she used to appear on Kilroy or Saturday morning shows or something like that. But they sometimes used to have a little caption.
Oh, did they? Even back then?
Yeah, a caption or an announcement saying, this should be construed as entertainment purposes only. Nothing should be construed from it, basically. Which was bloody annoying, considering they've put through some good stuff,
See, I would have to put on my tinfoil hat again and say this is actually to do with the dumbing down of humanity. I think religions may well have started off as, spiritual ideals and then quickly got jumped upon and became basically kind of like spiritual prisons, or if you like, kind of like a mind control network for those in control. Because don't forget, the church used to run, not exactly run the country, but rule the roost. What the Pope said went, end of story. And the kings were very subservient to the popes before Henry VIII, of course, when he created his own religion. And I think spirituality and mediumship, if you were to, for instance, prove the spirit world or prove that there is something beyond this life bypassing the church, I think that's a threat to the authorities of these religions that kind of essentially control mankind.
I think to add to that, when you go back to these old shows of especially Colin Fry, where you've got a circle of people there receiving readings, you can relate their prior warning, though, to the kind of warning that Darren Brown used to present on his show. He always used to start his show by walking towards the camera and saying, the following show that you're about to see combines magic, showmanship, psychology, misdirection, blah, 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 blah. And you're about to watch so more or less the disclaimer was there that this is entertainment and it's a combination of this, this and this. And the reason why the feats look so great is because at the end of the day, if it's not one of these things that I've already mentioned, it's a TV show. It can be edited. And it's to entertain. It's the very reason it got onto your television set in the first place. And with those mediumship demonstrations, fair play, that might be how those mediums claim to operate day to day when they go to a spiritualist church or what other setting that they do it in. But there's no control to it whatsoever. There's no parapsychologist on hand to actually say that, okay, I've screened these people and I know absolutely that you don't know any of these people and there's no direct connection to you and them. None of them have chatted to you before. In fact, none of them have mingled before coming into the TV show. That doesn't happen. No such controls seem to go in like that because it's not set up as a scientific study. It's more so, here's a group of people, what can the medium actually say about them and their deceased loved ones? So in that respect, I can understand the disclaimer, just because when you go to the shows like Darren Brown, where again, it's to do with psychology in some respects, but it's branching on examples of what could be psychic phenomena but isn't because he's doing it via different techniques. There's still a disclaimer, just so people know where they stand. Whenever it's a live experiment, it's made very clear that it's a live TV experiment, and usually they'll tell you what they've done to try and exclude different things actually coming in.
I don't know how you feel about this, but it's almost like Darren Brown, and I do like Darren Brown. I do, watching him, I do think he's very clever. But it's almost like because he fakes it, and he tells you that he fakes it, and he kind of like, he's very open that I am leading you down the garden path. Is kind of basically saying to you, but it's almost like because he does it his way, in the very naughty way, which is either researching people or earpieces or however he does it. And I've watched it when he's done kind of like psychic type things, and I don't know how he gets the information from people, but he must have some kind of research on them because he doesn't regard himself as a medium, and that's how he works. But because he does it that way, he assumes all the other mediums do it that way as well. And it's almost like coming across kind of like a sweetener and then assuming, well, sugar obviously doesn't exist kind of thing. Do you see where I'm coming from?
I wouldn't like to assume that his assumption is that's how all the other mediums are doing it. It goes back to what we said earlier with the TV. That's how TV would like to assume that things are going on. I've never spoken to Derham, but as I said before, I know that his interest in the early spiritualist literature. So if he has read it, and especially the stuff produced by places like the College of Psychic Studies, which worked with members of the Society for Psychical Research and even the Society for Psychical Research's early texts, then you'll see that there were some particular mediums like Mrs. Leonard, Mrs. Piper, and then even going through to people like I turned away from the mic. Eileen J. Garrett. I could list a load of people for you. They never found out what was actually going on in those circumstances, if indeed it was fraud. I'd love to know what he thinks off camera, because it's made very clear what position he has to present, even if it is actually his own view on camera, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I mean, have you heard on the grapevine what other people close to him say that his real views are?
No, I don't think they've got that close to actually kind of sit down and have those kinds of debates, really. They've just taken what he does as read. But I know that people that do know him have a kind of slightly different view, and that's purely from their own interests as well, of saying, well, yeah, there is a hell of a lot of fraud out there, a hell of a lot, but that doesn't mean to say that you should deny what has been collected, again, by the SPR and other organisations, where there are a few particular instances of people where the magicians had no idea what was going on, the escapologists that came to observe them had no idea what was going on, the scientists that were involved had no idea what was going on, controls were put in place and they didn't seem to be able to stop them doing what they could do. So what was going on in those few unique instances?
Oh, this is an interesting one, actually, Cal. I assume you're probably aware of the skull experiment.
Yes, though I'm not a massive fan of it, to be honest.
Oh, okay. Get into that. Why aren't you a fan of it?
Too many controls in place, and if I was there, I would have kicked off big time. I think I would have been very much like Tony Cornell, who I think did get kicked out of Skull, because I would not entertain for one moment a situation where the medium or anyone else claiming these situations has or insists on full control of the environment. If that's the case, something dodgy is going on, and you can't comply to that. The researcher must have control, and especially sitting in the dark as well. It's open to so much fraud, manipulation, and misinterpretation. So I think that the best and only report that people should really read on that is the proceedings that was produced by the Society for Psychical Research. I think it's the most detailed and fairest report. I think beyond that, any books, and there's the book by Solomon and Solomon, I think it was, I wasn't so pleased with that book and interpretation of it. And I've spoken to various people that were there, but people that were more so really open to the paranormal, people I know that don't so much jump to the various conventional explanations that could be there. They're more happy to jump straight to, oh, it was a spirit of the dead. Well, that doesn't help us out either way, because it's not explaining anything. But they were very kind of caught by the sensationalized views that were going on and the experiences that they had. But my view was, well, you were sat in the dark. And you agreed not to take in a camera, and you agreed not to move. So I'm sorry, you probably got a very interesting tale to tell. And they had, apparitions of small children sat on their lap where their faces were semi-formed and you could feel them, and you couldn't feel the inside of their head, though. You could just feel their face. Fantastic. It sounds incredible. But the conditions for me, they're terrible. So, you could be reporting all kinds of things that are fantastic, but you've got no control. So all kinds of things could happen. You've opened it up to the magician to let them do whatever they wish to do.
Was it in pitch black or was it dim? I thought it was
infrared light, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
If it's infrared light, there were certainly no recordings that I ever remember seeing of actually having a full view of the room from infrared. There was recordings going on that would actually show up from their development the light anomalies that were going on. But from the reports of people that went there, people that told me what it was like in the sitting, it was more or less pitch black.
Oh.
Sorry, if I put a dampener on.
I'm going to return that Amazon DVD now, the Skull. Now, I actually took part in a physical materialization seance, and I say that in quotes because that's how it's described. Okay. A place, and I won't mention the place. Well, I can, I suppose. I don't know. It's called Jenny's Sanctuary, and it's no disrepute to them. I just think it was the people that are visiting Genuine Sanctuary, because I think, I think they're trying to do a good thing, Genuine Sanctuary, but unfortunately, I think they're getting infiltrated by fraudsters. That's my personal opinion. And of course, I'm not a scientist, and I couldn't check every nook, cranny, and whatever. But that's the kind of general thing I formulated, and I take part in seances and mediumship. I've studied mediumship in developing circles and things, so it's not as if I'm a total skeptical person, because I've had telepathic thoughts, or whatever you want to call it, from the dead, if you want to call it that. But in this seance, there's supposedly this guy getting tied up, and he was the medium in the chair and things like that.
Sure, it was a seance, Neil.
Well. No, that was the following week. So basically,
and then they brought out the whip.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's all documented, I can assure you. So yeah, I always have that with an announcement to cover myself. So basically, yeah, they were producing luminescent plates that are supposedly flying in their thing. There was drums being played and things like that. Now, the biggest thing that really freaked me out, and it upset me in a sense of this is just ridiculous, was that they brought through this French girl who died in the Second World War. She was supposedly a spirit guide type thing. She was about 8 years old, but when you got a French girl that's coming through and she's talking, it sounded like, if you know the Tweenies TV series, a bit like the Teletubbies, the Tweenies, and they speak like this and they speak like that. It's like a guy doing a child's voice. This is exactly how it was. So, I believe you're a father, aren't you, Cal? So you've got a daughter, haven't you? So you know how your own child speaks, and you know that it's not a man emulating a child's voice. You know that the difference definitely between a child's voice and a male voice, and you know that when someone's trying to do a child's voice, it just sounds silly. And this is what it sounded like. And there wasn't even a French accent to it, you see. So I thought that was really rubbish. But then towards the end of this thing, I think they were getting confident that they'd hoodwinked everyone. This is what I felt. Because then they were going to do a materialised hand of this spirit guy called Jonathan who came through. And I must add that Jonathan was supposedly a Cockney guy that died in the 1980s. But in fact, he sounded very Irish to me. The voice of Jonathan sounded very Irish. He sounded almost like Dumbledore out of Harry Potter, played by Richard Harris in the original 2 Harry Potter movies. He had that kind of accent. And it was no strange thing to find out later that the actual medium himself was Irish, and also his brother was Irish that sat in the audience. So you have a potential accomplice there, and also the medium's wife sat in the audience, so you had a potential accomplice there as well. But the worst part is when they materialised the hand of the spirit guy Jonathan, and it came out from under this cloth in this sort of seance cabinet thing, the medium's cabinet, and everyone was invited to go and shake hands with it. And so I queued up with everyone else in the infrared light, shook hands with his hand, but there was one guy that wanted to lift the cloth all the way up, and they shouted, no, you're not allowed to do that, you're not allowed to do that. And it's like they were really worried of getting exposed. And anyway, I thought that was a load of rubbish. I was really convinced it was rubbish. And I was looking for evidence of maybe fraudulency that other people might have found out on the internet. So I'd looked for various reports, and I came across a report like the next day where someone had attended the same seance by the same medium about 4 years earlier, and it ran exactly parallel to my experiences as of that night, because it was like a script, and every magician works to a script. Certain people have to do certain things at certain key points, and it's exactly how this demonstration of physical mediumship happened. And so I thought, well, next time I come to this kind of thing, I'm definitely going to catch you out, because again, they check people for cameras, recorders, you take off shiny objects, anything like that. And I thought, how can I catch them out? And I thought this would be a good one for you, actually, if you're ever invited to go to this thing and you're not allowed to take a camera, is what you do. I haven't tested this out. This is my theory, is that when you're in the car park before you go into the seance room, is that you take a tube of oil paint or paint that takes a long time to dry, okay? And it can't be removed with water. Now, I'm an artist, so I use oil paints. Now, oil paints have to be removed with something called white spirit, okay? It cleans brushes and things like that. It can't be washed off with water. And so what I would do, I would sit in the car park before I went into the seance room with a tube of oil paint, and I'd squeeze a little bit of this tube of oil paint onto my thumb or my finger, it didn't really matter which, and then put a plaster over it, okay? So it looks like I've got a plaster on, so I've cut my finger. And so when I'm checked for recording objects, cameras or whatever, they'll see the plaster and not even consciously acknowledge it. They'll just see a plaster, oh, he's had an injury, and not even think about it. But when I'm in the queue to go and shake hands with this materialised spirit hand, I will make sure I'm the very last person in the queue, and I'll go up and I'll remove my plaster, and then I'll rub the wet oil paint all over this materialised spirit hand. Because if it's genuinely a spirit hand, it'll dematerialise and go back to the spirit world, no problem. But if it isn't, then that person's got a problem because they got oil paint on their hands and they can't wash it off, and they won't have any white spirit, pardon the pun, in the seance room to wash it off. And so when that person, i.e. the medium, goes to mingle with people with a cup of tea and biscuits after the seance, he will either be covering his hand in some way, or he won't even make an appearance. He will go off somewhere because he's got red oil paint on his hands. So that's one way to catch him out.
Are you assuming that that person's there beforehand then? Because if they've just been hidden away, you'll just never know about it because they've snuck off somewhere else. That goes back to the whole idea that they've dematerialized. So you'd have to actually check that no one's actually leaving the building or sneaking off to another room.
Yeah, I suspected at the time that I felt that it could have been the guy's brother, because there was a number of things, because the drums were being played, and I kept thinking, well, whoever's playing the drums is really good at drums. There was a child's drum, and it was there, and it's being played supposedly by the spirits. Then I kind of made a few connections. I thought, well, hang on. The medium's Irish, his brother's in the audience, he was Irish. Maybe the Boys Brigade, which is an Irish thing, maybe they both grew up playing the drums in that. It was just a possible thing, you know. And also, at the very end of this seance, the medium appeared mysteriously outside of the seance cabinet in the middle of the room almost. But the interesting thing was, everyone gasped thinking, oh, wow, that's fantastic. But this medium was tied to a chair that had a runner on it. So instead of like 4 legs, it came down into almost perfect smooth aluminium runner, which could be dragged across the room, across a carpet, by one person, because it had those smooth runners instead of the legs. The chair was specifically chosen for that reason, I think. And also with all that loud music going on, you can't hear that happening, especially in the darkness. So it looks like the spirit world had dematerialised the medium and materialised him in the room for everyone to gasp at later on. That's another thing I felt, yeah.
Go back to that. You said that a French girl allegedly came through. So was she speaking in English or in French?
Well, that's the other test I'd like to do. If I went there again, and I know that they obviously run to this kind of script, and they bring this French girl through, I would like to have a French-speaking person there to then challenge them and speak to them in French, because she was speaking pure English to me. Like I said, if anyone types in tweenies on YouTube, and that's the kind of voice that it sounded like. It sounded absolutely ridiculous, you know.
I was at Clifton Hall once, and the medium claimed that was going on. I think they said, oh, it's a French woman or a French girl. And I think before they even said anything else, I said, oh, could I ask some questions of them? And they went, yes, certainly. I'll do my best to kind of relay their response. I went, okay. And it's just some basics, because I don't speak fluent French, but I was just saying, comment t'appelles-tu, quel âge as-tu, j'habite-tu, and things like that. You know, who are you? How old are you? Where do you live? And things like that. And they just stunned silence, because they had no idea I was going to speak in French, and they just went, oh, they've gone now. I'm like, how convenient. How really? I said, well, that's probably because you were fibbing. That's right.
So I bet there's some genuine French words flying around after that. Now, tell us about your book. You've written this book called Phone Calls from the Dead. So how did that come about? And tell us what it's about.
Well, I've written a few books. So if anyone's probably going to say that at the end, but if anyone's interested in checking them all out, go to www.callumecooper.com. So there's my plug there. But Telephone Calls from the Dead was the very first one that I put together. And it was before I went back to the University of Northampton to start my doctorate, when I was looking at bereavement and the impact of bereavement and how people cope. And what I was doing with Telephone Calls from the Dead, it came about as a result of being very interested in the researcher D. Scott Rogo, who was a parapsychologist. He'd done a lot of guest lecturing throughout California. He was a guest lecturer at John F. Kennedy University for their master's program in parapsychology. And his life was cut short, unfortunately. In 1990, he was murdered at home, stabbed to death. Nothing to do with his interest in the paranormal, but he was a unique guy. He'd made his whole living as a parapsychologist, mainly from his guest lectures and writing books. He'd written about 30 books before the time that he passed away. And he was just a very good researcher. He was a walking encyclopedia for parapsychology. And going through his books, reading them as an undergraduate, there was one that I was really interested in, and that was Phone Calls from the Dead. And he co-wrote it with more or less his mentor when he started to get into this in the 1960s. And that was Raymond Bayliss, who was also a very good psychical researcher. And it was essentially a book where they'd had a few people come to them and say, I've had this strange experience with the telephone. Someone called me who wasn't actually at home at the time. They were verified to be elsewhere, but it was their voice, their characteristics, their knowledge. And then in other instances, people saying that after they'd lost someone, they suffered a loss, or long after that person had died, they had a telephone call which they believed was from that deceased person. They didn't really take any notice of these experiences to start with, because they weren't, before the 1970s, they weren't really documented as any form of study in any of the journals. But there were some scattered in some books and some mentions of people, especially Thomas Edison, early on allegedly making a device that you could use essentially as this telephone to contact the dead. And so they thought, well, let's actually go about asking people about these experiences and collect them. And they ended up collecting 50 cases. They analysed them. They looked at their characteristics. And in 1979, they produced a book called Phone Calls from the Dead that discussed the study, all these different elements that I mentioned. And so in 2008, 2009, I'd seen recent news reports of someone dying on a train during a train collision in California and allegedly phoning his family after he died. And the media reports reported it as such. So I decided to follow that up and find out what was going on in modern day. And I'll leave it at that point because I think you're going to a commercial break.
Yeah, I mean, before we go to the break, Andy, have you heard of these phone calls from the dead?
Yeah, I have. They're very strange. Yeah, I don't know what to make, because it implies that if it is coming from a spirit entity, they would have some knowledge in how to tap into our technology and use our technology, which offers a whole new kind of like perspective on things.
I wouldn't say entirely, because look at poltergeist instances. If you're suggesting that's a spirit of the dead, what about electrical manipulation in those cases? The light switch, ovens and other things turning themselves on and off.
This is it. And then we need to question, is it really human entities that we're dealing with or something else? That's a whole other ball game.
Well, I'd certainly say, first off, I don't know how much more time we've actually got. Oh, we've actually got a little bit more time to chat. But putting the idea of a discarnate entity or survival of consciousness right at the far end of the spectrum, we have so much room for error, fraud, misinterpretation. I mean, one thing being that you can call people on withheld numbers. You could also target people at a time of grief when they've lost someone. Prank calls. They seem to happen quite regularly. Misinterpretation, especially when someone's lost a child and someone is calling home and they say mum, dad, and they realise they've got the wrong number, but that person has lost a child. How many people are called mum and dad? A lot of people are. And that's enough for them to get confirmation that their child has survived beyond death, but actually it was some kid that has actually called the wrong number. And at the end of the day, what you've actually got is someone presenting you with a report, and there's no way of following it up, except for with the phone companies, if they've got the exact time, the exact day. So when you look at these accounts at face value, you've got a lot of conventional explanations that you could actually put to them. They only start to get interesting when they followed it up with the phone company and they have a register of every call that's gone in and come out, except for the one that you report at the time that it took place. If there's veridical information involved, so if it is a phone call from the deceased, they say that they say specific information that you shouldn't actually know about, but in following it up, it turns out to be correct. Or if you pass the phone around, so very much like in a collective apparition case, multiple people have seen it. In this case, multiple people have heard the voice. and interacted with it, only to discover afterwards that person's been dead a good 24 hours or maybe a week. So there are those instances. And then on the other side, it's easy to verify that you've had a conversation with someone and then they say, well, you can't have spoken to me at that time. I was here with such and such, or I was at work with these people. So then you can go back and check with the phone company, where did that call come from? Those ones happen a lot, and they're quite interesting because they usually happen at the point that someone intends to make a phone call, but for whatever reason they change their mind and go and do something else. So it's like this multiple worlds theory, people like Professor Bernard Carr have looked at it in terms of the multi-universe theory as well. He's one of the vice presidents of the Society for Psychical Research and one of Stephen Hawking's ex-students. And he believes that a lot of psychical occurrences might occur because we need to kind of look at the idea of multiple worlds. And they fit the bill perfectly with these experiences, where for every decision that you make, it creates alternative options and realities that come out. But for some people, they get a glimpse of this telephone call happening that the person that intended to make it, they've gone and actually done something else. So their other reality is played out. And you can see this as well with why the vast majority of apparition sightings are actually of living people, not of dead people. Is it because of them having been to that place or having the intention to go to that place where you see them at, like a supermarket or something like that? And when you say later on, oh, I saw you in such and such today, they say, I wasn't there. Well, if it wasn't you, you've got a twin, they look just like you and they were wearing your clothes and they've got your hair, etc. The only way you could really verify that is to go up and poke them and see if they're actually there, just like in Ghostbusters when Egon is going around the hotel with this PKE meter and he goes up to one of the guests and he gives him a little poke with his finger just to check that the guy's actually there.
There's this I can't say it now, electronic voice phenomena, EVP, which is like a variation of telephone calls from the dead. And I know there's lots of researchers worldwide, and they've been doing it for the last sort of 50 years, really, haven't they? Starting with reel-to-reel tape recorders. In fact, people found that when, I believe, in the 1920s and 30s, you could actually make your own records, with wax cylinders and things like that. And they were finding they were getting all sorts of voices appearing on their recordings. They couldn't work out where they were coming from. They largely ignored them for a while, but these voices still persisted as they went into variations of recording technologies, reel-to-reel tape recorders and things like that. And we've got reports of them coming through on computers and that. So there's a lot of evidence for this kind of thing, isn't there, really, with communications of sort coming from some place, at least. I mean, there was a Scottish engineer, I believe, he did some work for NASA. I forget his name off the top of my head. Do you know the guy I'm talking about?
Yeah, probably best you do forget his name.
Oh, really? Oh, right.
Yeah.
Is that all been blown apart then?
No, we'll just leave it there. That's a discussion for some other time. I wouldn't say there's a lot of evidence. I mean, there's a lot of research that's gone into it. I'm very, very cynical on there being... well, no, I'm not cynical. I am open to the idea. I'm very skeptical. I've seen the evidence for EVPs, and especially from dedicated researchers that are very enthusiastic, that have got this, that, and the other. And I've not been convinced. It doesn't seem to go beyond anything but audible pareidolia for me, where you're kind of making sense of a sound in random sounds, and your brain is tuned in to do that. It tries to make sense of the world around it. If you can't hear something, it will try and relate to what you understand as sounds, and the same goes for shapes in darkened rooms, or when you look at the clouds and think, wow, that cloud looks like a racing car. It does, but it's not actually a racing car, it's a cloud. And so when you listen to these EVPs, they become more evident when the researcher, I say in quotation marks, says, oh, this person is saying get out. Well, if you hadn't have told me that, I would have actually come to my own conclusion as to what they actually said. You've added an interpretation. Now my brain cannot help but hear that. That's just the way that we're wired up and we work. EVPs, they're quite distinct from the telephone calls because it's someone purposefully going out to record alleged voices of the dead or strange bangs, raps and taps. But as you quite rightly mentioned, a lot of their discovery was through accident as well. But there was no intention there to go out and record them. It was just on playback. They discovered these strange sounds. And that led to the idea of, well, if I actually go out with the intention of doing this, will I get these recordings? I think that the best person to talk about on these matters, and you should probably try and get her on the show, is Anne Winsper. She's just finishing off her doctorate at the University of Central Lancashire, and it's specifically on, I think the title is very much The Psychology of Electronic Voice Phenomena, where she's looked at all this past research, these people that we've mentioned, and what she's discovered from her study as well, with regards to setting up trials that people could go through, seeing what they can hear and interpret. So yeah, I'm not overly convinced by EVP, but there've been some really big, extensive studies into it. With the telephone calls, they're spontaneous. They just seem to happen. People say, I was washing the pots and the telephone called, when suddenly... I'm interested in spontaneous experiences. People have no intention in the vast majority of cases to have these experiences. They just happen, and they play out like any other telephone call. Whereas with the EVPs, there's a lot of interpretation behind what's been recorded.
I don't know if you're aware, there was an American guy. I watched this documentary on YouTube called Calling Planet Earth, and that's where I first came across it. I also came across the Scottish engineer you don't want to talk about. This American chap, he was interested in EVP, and he's in contact with various EVP researchers around the world. And I think this guy was in California, and his phone rang one day, and the call came through, and it said, "I'm Konstantin Radovich," and he was an EVP researcher from somewhere like Russia or somewhere like that. I can't remember now. Who died maybe a year or two earlier. And the guy's thinking, "Oh my God, I wish I could record this." So he says, "Can you call me again sometime, and I'll have my recorder set up." Yeah, that could be the guy. And so he rang another time. I don't know the time difference between both calls, but this time he said he managed to record him. And he says, "Can I record you?" And he goes, "Yes, of course," or something. And he recorded this very long 20-minute conversation with this Konstantin Radovich. Whether it's genuine or not, I don't know, but it's just an interesting thing. Have you heard about that?
Dr. Konstantin Radova produced the book Breakthrough, which came with an LP record that you could actually listen to, so you could actually hear some of these recordings for yourself as well. I think this is where I discussed it with the late John Randall, who was a biologist and psychical researcher, who he said that when he read Breakthrough, he just threw it in the bin. He didn't like it. He didn't think it was a very good piece of research. Radova could speak several languages, so his EVPs were open to so much interpretation. I mean, if you hear the word mare in the recording, well, is that French for mother or something to do with the sea, or is it to do with a female horse in English, you know? And it's just what you interpret to be that word anyway. If you have multiple language as your skill set, then you're going to come out with multiple interpretations as well. But yeah, him calling different people, that was reported by Mark Macy in the USA, and then I think it was also reported in France, Germany, and Spain as well. He'd called various different places, and people reported it. There was a study that was published in the ITC journal where people had taken recordings of Dr. Radova when he was alive, and then these ones from the telephone calls. And they wanted to see if it was actually him through seeing if the audio acoustical properties, so the voice pattern recognition, would actually match the recording of him alive and the recording of him being dead. Now, they didn't match, and that leads us to two different things. One, it's someone just calling up and replicating his voice because he spoke very deeply. This is Konstantin Radova speaking. It'd be very much like that. It's a very intimidating voice. So one, it's someone impersonating Dr. Radova, and they're withholding their number and stopping people getting access to where the call's coming from, which is very much possible by today's technology and even technology in the 1990s. Or you could argue, well, it is him, and why should they match? Because the recording of him alive is the acoustical properties of his voice coming from a biological voice box in his living body, and the recording of him allegedly after he's died is meant to be an interpretation created through, you know, a manipulation of the electrons inside the telephone that produce an electrical voice that I mean, when I speak to you on the telephone, as I'm speaking to you now through the internet, what you're hearing is a representation of my voice. But it's still a recording of what my voice sounds like as I'm alive. And it's coming from an audible voice box. What they had was this guy, they knew he was dead, and he's allegedly calling after he died. So is it just coming from within the telephone itself? So anyway, it was inconclusive because the voice patterns didn't match. I would certainly lead very strongly towards it being a hoax, but they're still open to further questioning and other things you could potentially do with those two recordings to actually take things a little bit further. But yes, to cut a long story short, I've heard of them. They were very popular for a time, and I haven't heard anything crop up about them since.
I mean, it'd be great if he could call again and just explain it. I know that in the recording I heard, he then passed the phone, or he said, "Let me pass the device." It's interesting. Let me pass the device over to some other guy who died like maybe a few hundred years earlier, like a priest or something like that, Monsignor or something, who then spoke as well, which was interesting. Obviously, they couldn't get a voice pattern on him because he had died before voice recordings came along, but it was interesting. Anyway, I think we've reached our first hour successfully. Very interesting it is too. You're listening to the Paranormal Peep Show with myself, Andrew Chaplin, and Cal Cooper, psychologist and author of Telephone Calls from the Dead, and we'll be carrying on chatting to Cal and hopefully another guest after this break. Join us in a minute. Now listen, Mr. Putin, what's all this nonsense about nerve agents in drinks?
This is nothing to do with Russia. We are completely innocent. If you want unbiased, non-fake news, listen to Paranormal UK Radio Network.
Hi and welcome back to the Paranormal Peep Show, and this is myself, Neil Geddes-Ward, with Andrew Chaplin.
Hello.
And we're talking to Cal Cooper about his Phone Calls from the Dead book and also his parapsychology research. But also we're joined by a friend of mine and a friend of Cal's as well. That's Carolyn Cox, who is also a psychologist, but she also happens to be a medium, which is quite a rare thing because most psychologists tend to be sceptical of the paranormal world. So welcome to the programme, Carolyn, and how are you?
Hello, Carolyn.
Hi. I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
We're fine. Thank you for joining us. So, Carolyn, can you give some background about yourself and how you became a psychologist and how you got into the mediumship, or which way round it was?
Yeah, sure. The mediumship, I think, has been around forever. Although I didn't always have beliefs, I was quite sceptical until I was about 21, and then I suppose too many things were happening that I couldn't explain. And so I then started to forge beliefs that perhaps there was life after death and that we could communicate with people who'd passed over. And the psychology came along when I turned 40. I wanted to do something that scared me. And so I decided that I would start a psychology degree. And I sort of loved that so much that I then went on to do a master's in applied positive psychology. And then the exploration of mediumship and psychological effects came about because there's an awful lot of research out there on whether mediumship is what it says on the tin. So it's quite evidence proof based. And so I wanted to look at there's so many people that seek mediumship. So I wanted to know what it was that they were getting out of it.
So did it scare you, your research and becoming a psychologist, as you thought it might do?
No, not really.
Well, that failed then. Okay, so you got to know Cal because he was doing research as well. Is that right? You both kind of
yes,
research
we both touched on some research at the Arthur Findlay College.
My memory of meeting you was because Professor Chris Rowe, Dr. David Saunders, and Rachel Evenden, they'd gone down to the Arthur Findlay College to start forming links. It's before we had our own lab there. The University of Northampton Psychology Division has a specific lab now set up there for testing mediums, and we can run other kinds of parapsychological experiments there too. But this was just back when they were attending just for the science weeks. And I'd heard about Carolyn because of a heated debate that she got in with Professor Rowe. And I thought, oh, she sounds interesting. And then I think I got her added on Facebook, and I thought, I want to meet her. This would be really interesting. So I decided to go to the next Science Week. I didn't really kind of get involved in any of the lectures, and I didn't go to any of the readings either, which my colleagues were saying, why have you come down if you're not getting involved in the readings? And I said, well, any of the physical demonstrations, the readings, if you come out saying something's happened that you can't figure out, then I'll come in. And that didn't happen, and that they kind of like started pulling faces, the fact that I made this prediction that nothing had impressed them. But from their perspective, as long-time researchers, I'm not saying nothing was going on, that they were happening for a reason, that people were getting something out of them. But what I was doing was, I just thought I'd check out the grounds, the building. I'd never seen it. I went to look at some of the history of the Arthur Findlay College. And then Carolyn was there, and because it was a big science week, that I encourage anyone to go, they're fantastic. They got stalls set up, selling different things, secondhand books, and tea and cake was the main thing. So I think I spent the vast majority of my time sat outside with Carolyn, eating cake and drinking tea, and just chatting. I think we got to know a lot about each other through that event, and then of course discussions went through into the evening, through to the dinner and the bar and stuff like that. And from that point on, I think we kind of merged with our.
Day.
It was a very good day, and we merged with our interests not just for parapsychology, where we obviously come at it from two very different angles, but then we've got this perfect overlap of more or less identical opinions when it comes to positive psychology, which is where Carolyn did her degrees in this kind of area at Bucks-New University. But I got contacts there with people that run the course, like Dr. Matthew Smith, whose background is parapsychology, but he's now running this MAP program, the Masters in Applied Positive Psychology. And my own research in parapsychology had overlaps to positive psychology. So we kind of started meeting and talking through these two different avenues. We've got the parapsychology side and the positive psychology side of things as well. So we frequently see and hear from each other.
So for those who've just tuned in, just briefly describe what positive psychology is as opposed to either conventional psychology or parapsychology.
Oh, Carolyn can do that. She's got a master's in it.
It's basically the science of well-being, or what makes life worth living. So where mainstream psychology looks at pathology or what's wrong, positive psychology has now branched out in a different form with the second wave, and now is looking at the dark side of psychology, but is much more focused on things like resilience, well-being, happiness, and that type of thing. And that's why when I did my thesis for my master's degree, I wanted to look at kind of both strands. And so I took a positive psychology approach on a paranormal topic, and that's what I did my research on. So I interviewed people, 7 people basically, looking at what effects they had from having a meaningful sitting with a medium. And then I went on to turn that into a paper with Cal and Dr. Smith, as he mentioned, that's on the MAP course as well.
Would you say with your training, Carolyn, that because you're a medium as well, do you give readings presumably to people on a one-to-one basis? Would that be correct?
Yes, not very often, but I do indeed, and I sometimes do platform.
So what I was going to ask is, do you sometimes? I think every medium, including myself, has in the back of their head like a little skeptic or a little voice saying, well, maybe you guessed that, or maybe kind of that was implied by the other person, kind of thing. It's maybe kind of like a balancing type thing. But did you find that with your psychology training, you found yourself scrutinizing yourself to the point where you were almost not getting any more links because you were being too rational and too scientific? Did that happen at all?
I wouldn't really say so. I think you're always going to have moments where you doubt what's going on. But what I found, that was why it was so interesting having the conversation that Cal told you about, that then became a little bit infamous, where I was arguing that I felt that mediumship related to certain areas of the brain. But what I found was that by applying the science of positive psychology to the mediumship, I was seeing things that people were gaining as positives, for growth, such as hope, resilience, and specifically post-traumatic growth, which is an area that hasn't had that much research, and certainly not when it looks at mediumship. And so that's why I was really interested to see if I could get a little bit of kind of momentum going there, and hopefully that'll carry forward and other people might look at it.
So with that, you've got 3 different areas that parapsychology can potentially branch off into. So you can have anomalistic psychology, where anyone studying that, especially at Goldsmiths University with Professor Chris French, is interested in saying, here are instances of seemingly paranormal experiences, but this is what we already know from psychology and current scientific paradigms that explain why people believe they've had this experience. It seems to fit the bill perfectly. Parapsychology would take that into account, but is interested in taking things a step further and saying, well, in this instance, what we know doesn't seem to apply. So do we have something else new to learn where it's suggesting ESP is occurring or some aspect of someone's personality is surviving beyond death? Then step that over into what Carolyn's been mentioning, where we have a parapsychological topic, but we're not interested in challenging its ontology. You know, what is it? Where's it come from? How's it operating? Is it something new to learn? No, what's its actual impact on the person that claims the experience? So we're interested in the clinical applications, especially when people in bereavement claim that they've had an anomalous experience, they've interacted with the dead or something else. How's that affected their health and well-being? So we're interested in the psychology and physiology of it. Or even people that have had a spontaneous experience that's traumatic. What can you do in terms of applying counselling to those people to actually help them and say, look, you're not alone. There's loads of documentation for people having these experiences. You're not necessarily going through any form of psychosis. And with that, you're bound to have so many overlaps to applications of positive psychology.
Yes, absolutely. And for me, it was that, you know, obviously working as a medium, you see, Andrew, the impact that it can have on people when you're able to give them some kind of clarity about either death circumstances or, you know, there's often unresolved issues that need some kind of addressing. And if as a medium, you can bring that to the table and you can watch somebody transform from deep set grief to growth and to post-traumatic growth, then that's a really big thing, I feel. And I mean, that's not to say that some mediums aren't, you know, that there's going to be Barnum effect stuff going on. Not all mediums are as good as they claim to be. Not all mediums are actually doing anything at all to do with mediumship. But there are some really good gold standard mediums, and to see what they bring to the table is really quite mind-blowing.
Oh, I know. I think what I was getting at is kind of put it this way: when I'm doing my readings for people, and I really enjoy doing them, the more I don't think about what's coming to me and just kind of flow with it, the better it comes. And if I find myself either questioning it or kind of like looking at it from a rational point of view, it almost kills it. It's almost like taking a pair of scissors and snipping that cord. And what I was kind of like wondering, Carolyn, with you personally, because you've got your psychological training, do you ever find yourself slipping into psychology mind, putting your psychology hat on, which then would kind of like question what you're getting through, and is it like, as you say, Barnum effect, or is it really mediumistic, and then kind of like killing your readings in mid-flow? Or do you kind of like take your psychology hat, put that to one side, and just kind of like flow with it with your mediumship side?
I think that's a really good question, but also it relates more, I think, to because the mediumship was first, and I was already grounded in my beliefs about that. Bringing psychology to the table didn't really alter that. In fact, I've done some research with Dr. Smith in a psychology laboratory where I was the medium, and they brought in various people to test whether the mediumship was doing what it suggested it was doing. And that, although we haven't really done anything with that research did have some really interesting findings. So, yeah.
As I was kind of like, because I started off around about year 2000, I think, kind of like with my development, and what kind of like halted me slightly in my process was I started off in kind of like spiritualist development circles. Then I started watching programs like Darren Brown, who we were talking about earlier before you came, actually. And that actually put quite a big spanner in my works. I actually found myself questioning, is what I'm getting real? Is it for real, or is it kind of like how Darren Brown suggests in terms of cold reading, or reading off somebody, or kind of like assuming things from somebody just by looking at them? And that took me a lot of willpower and a lot of kind of testing myself to try and get me back on track and back on into belief, I suppose, if you see what I mean.
I think if you haven't had at least one existential crisis as a medium, then you're doing it wrong. So I completely can relate to that. But then Dr. Cooper himself once did a cold reading on me, and when I looked at him, he'd written all these things on his arm.
Actually, one of the funniest things ever was there was a medium that went up against Chris French on I think it was This Morning, ITV's This Morning, and Chris French was trying to disprove mediumship by saying that it's all cold reading, and so
it was Gordon Smith.
Oh, was it?
Gordon Smith. Remember, we had a conversation quite a few episodes ago when we had the guest whose name escapes me, so please forgive me if you're listening.
And basically,
yeah,
they went up against Chris French, and Chris French was so they had a test subject, and they were giving the test subject 2 readings. One of them was a Barnum statement reading by Chris French, and one of them was by the medium. And they didn't tell the test subject which one was which, and they read them both out. And the test subject said, that one sounds really generalistic. I'm not sure about that one. And that was Chris French's one. And the other one sounds really spot on. They couldn't have known that. And that was the actual medium.
Yeah.
And Chris French kind of like blew his own theory out of the water by his own demonstration, which I thought was very...
because off the record, Chris French apparently said to Gordon Smith, when they're both having a cigarette outside the TV studio, he said, "You made me look really stupid in there." And he said, "No, you made yourself look stupid. You were the one that set up the experiment,
Yeah.
So, like you say, he shot himself completely in the foot. Anyway, Carolyn, you was going to say something. Sorry.
Oh, what I was?
Oh, well, it sounded like you said something, but...
I'd add to that, in that kind of instance, it is a kind of 50-50 choice, and Gordon does that professionally as well when it comes to, especially if he's given kind of at least some basic information, right, that this is the lady's name, she's this age, and she's from this area of the country, and that's all I'm going to tell you. But at least then you have something to focus on who you're giving the reading for.
But isn't that an assumption that he's been given that information? We don't know.
No, I'm just saying that's very generic. At least it gives him something to focus on. Otherwise, if you just say, give me a reading, it could be for anyone. So you need some sort of focus of, you are going to be giving a reading that you're going to have to write down. We're not going to let you meet that person, but here's the person. He's, that's what he's doing day in, day out. Whereas Chris is trying to demonstrate in that instance, how the Barnum script can be very generalized. And in that kind of instance, they derive more meaning from what Gordon is doing, either because it matches better than the Barnum script, or because Gordon is actually doing what he claims to be doing. You can interpret that in 2 ways, but it just so happens that in that case, the Barnum was too general to fit that person, and it was Gordon's option, which was the other. But it's a choice of 1 out of 2.
True, but I would say that it was quite an emphatic, that was a very bland statement versus that was absolutely spot on.
And so if we wanted to take that further, we'd have to actually draw our conclusions on more than just one person.
He did it on 3 or 4 people, I seem to recall, for this.
Oh, did he?
Yeah, it was on live. It was this morning show. It was live. And I think they had maybe 3 callers that they'd rung up and said, right, okay, Chris French did the first thing. And then Gordon Smith did the second person or something like that. They both worked on the same people. And then each person came back with their responses. And in all the cases, I believe, they all said that Dr. Chris French, who was, called himself another name, of course, for the reading, was general, not that great. But the other bloke, whoever he was, which was Gordon Smith, yeah, he was well spot on, they were saying. He was really accurate. So either Gordon Smith is a really, really talented medium, or he's a bloody clever psychologist, sort of whatever.
And you'd think that you'd think that Chris French, being a psychologist at a qualified one and a highly regarded one at Goldsmith, you'd think he would have the upper hand in knowing what kind of psychological statements to make people really think that he was a medium, don't you think?
Yeah. I send that back again to being experienced and used to doing it. So last time this goes back to when Dr. Matthew Smith was kind of trying to see if he could actually pass himself off as a psychic. And he believed that maybe there's some sort of way of doing it if you practice and go through the training that suggested. He was taking all kinds of advice from everywhere, and that project kind of fell away. I don't know where his mind is on that at the moment. But anyway, I thought on this day at Tutbury Castle, I would do the same thing next to him. It's for a charity event, but I would do it purposefully saying, look, I'm not a psychic, I'm a psychologist, and everything that I'm going to say to you is from cold reading and Barnum scripts. Now, the only way I had the upper hand there was these people were sat in front of me. I had things to work off of, such as body language and things such as that. But I'd been practicing the night before, and I was cramming into my head Barnum scripts, so I didn't have to even have the piece of paper there with me. I'd just got at least 10 different kind of generic stories I could keep on recycling. And for, some of the groups are absolutely crap. I didn't get anything. But for some people, they left thanking me the whole day and shaking my hand at every opportunity, saying, thank you so much for that. It was really interesting. I said, I'm not a psychic. I'm not a medium. And they said, we know you're not, but that was such a good reading. Thank you so much. I feel so much better. I'm like, for what?
Strange.
Could you
Very strange.
just a slight edge? I mean, could you? I mean, they say that people have got their own natural level of ability of psychic mediumship and things like that. It could be that you are intuitively, without realising it, doing an absolute genuine psychic reading without realising it. Would you?
No, I was. No. I was absolutely fooling these people because they were filling in the gaps. So, I was giving them something that was so widely spread that they would narrow it down. So, an example, I go beyond basic things such as there's an anniversary coming up or it's just gone. And it relates to you. It could be a birthday, but it might be some other significant event. Does that make sense to you? And then yes, because it could be a wedding or a funeral or some other things like that. And typically people will answer to that as well, saying yes, something's just come up or it's just gone. I mean, we even know the statistics of, to have so many people in a room and at least 2 people to share the birthday. The statistics aren't that high. You need around 21, 22 people for that to happen. And people say,
that's how I came into mediumship in the first place, because I was a complete skeptic and I was in a group of people who'd been to a spiritualist church and were really full of, this wonderful messages and stuff. And I said, it's an absolute load of bunkum. They pick an older lady in the audience who's about 80 and they say, I've got your friend Edna here and she's got bad knees and she's telling me you have too. And so then I said, right, I'm going to do some mediumship for somebody here. You pick and I'll do it. I'd never met these people before. I only knew one person. That wasn't the person I did the sitting in inverted commas with. And yet, ironically, I was telling this girl names and door numbers, door colours, all these things. As far as I was concerned, I was just pulling off the top of my head, making it up as I went along. When I finished, this girl was in tears and she said, that was all really true. And I said, no, absolute bunkum. And the thing about mediumship is you can't practice it. You go in with a completely blank slate. You have no idea what you're going to say. You have no idea what's going to come up. And you just open your mouth and hope for the best, because then all this information starts kind of coming out. And I do believe, even like with the Derren Brown thing, that I've always thought it hasn't caused me to question, like Andrew was saying, that whether mediumship is true. It caused me to question whether or not he's an actual psychic medium without.
Do you know what, Carolyn? I've heard this theory. It's a really interesting one. Really interesting. Is he tapping into something that he thinks is psychological, whereas it might actually be mediumistic?
Let me go back to my example. So, I'd done all the generic names and dates and ages and stuff like that I thought it's going to relate to people anyway. It's just very common, and you can do that by a show of hands in an audience. So the things that they found specific that I'm saying they filled in the gap for were just me doing stabs in the dark that I knew they would narrow down by reading their body language and just using some common psychology. So this one group of people, this couple, I wasn't getting anything right in terms of these guesses. So I said, well, I tell you what I'm doing right now. I'm actually in your house, and I'm going through the house, and I'm doing a double take out of your kitchen window, and it looks through onto the garden, and there's something associated with water. There's something in your garden that shouldn't be there. I can relate that to many friends. I can even relate it to myself. I've just had the floor redone in 4 rooms. I'm constantly renovating this place, and I've had loads of stuff that I've literally just taken to the tip today that was sat in the garden overnight that shouldn't have been there. So I thought this could be a number of things, a washing machine, things like that. And so their response to me saying that, which is where you could see they have just filled in the gap and associated it with me. There is something in your garden that should not be there. It's associated with water. Their response, how did you know that we have got a toilet in the middle of our garden? I don't know that. I don't know you've got a toilet in the middle of your garden. I've just said that there's something there that shouldn't be there, and it's associated with water. You filled in the rest and said, my God, you're incredible. But then I just said, yeah, that's what I was saying, and they took it away. Same goes for a few other people. It was that kind of, I'd given them something so wide and open that they narrowed it down and said, how did you know that? I didn't know that.
That's kind of more fortune telling, though, in a way. But what I'm talking about when I say mediumship is where you sit down with somebody that you've never met before, not in an audience where you're at a spiritualist church or whatever.
No, that's what I was doing here. It was couples that came up to this table and we sat there and spoke for about 20 minutes each.
But when you've got somebody that sits down in front of you, you've never met them before, you don't even ask their name because you don't need to know, and you ask them nothing about themselves, but you can say something to them like, I have your son with me, he passed to spirit at 23, and he's wanting to communicate with you today. I feel that's very different.
Oh, that's different. I'd have to make clear that during the time of me doing that, I didn't make any suggestion that I could contact the dead. So I avoided all of that. There was nothing about, I've got someone here in spirit. It was all about things that were coming up, things that had happened, things about themselves. I didn't want to kind of branch on the life after death thing, or that I could get in contact with the dead either. In case I don't profess to do that. I am not a psychic. I'm a psychologist. So I thought, I'm going to tell you first and foremost, I'm using this by techniques that we know. I'm not contacting anyone, and I'm not a psychic, but still see what you make of it. Even then, people were still impressed, thankful, and wondered, how the hell are you doing that? And I just thought
what mediumship can potentially bring to the table, going back to the research, if somebody can sit down and have something resolved that they may never have known why, or, I mean, in my research, I interviewed 7 people. 2 of them had lost someone to suicide. And in both cases, what they reported was that this person had come through and brought healing purely on the basis that they were able to say, look, it was nothing you did, it was nothing you said, it was just something that I didn't see any other way, etc., etc. And they gave such robust evidence for that person that they were able to move into the stages of grief rather than remaining in complicated grief. And to me, that's slightly different than telling somebody a novel feature in their garden. It's the impact it has on them. So mediumship, where you're actually giving really robust evidence, versus pretty much Barnum effect, where, as you've said yourself, you're kind of looking at what the possibilities are that they might have. For me, it's the difference between really good gold standard mediumship, where people are almost taken through the process of grief like they would be with a therapist or counsellor, but much quicker. It's bringing to the table when it's done like that. Yeah,
I totally agree with you, and that's the branch to PP and also parapsychology as well, the clinical application of it. Mediumship has never been my kind of strongest or my main interest within parapsychology. I've left that to people like Rachel. She's approached it very much from that kind of therapeutic practice point of view, because she's also a qualified counsellor. I think I've offended a lot of mediums in the past when I went out to like the Forever Family Foundation, that was set up purely for mediums that have gone through this kind of very set of tasks. They've been observed as being good, as you call this, gold standard of mediums, and they're kind of presented with contact details for various people that look at the organisation that want mediumship as an alternative to bereavement counselling, and they go after these mediums. And I've gone to, I'm a scientific advisor for the Forever Family Foundation, and when I went over to North Carolina and got to see some of these mediums perform, I think we're in the bar afterwards, and one of them said, what did you think of that? And I said, well, I won't tell you what I think of your reading, but I'll just tell you what I think in general. And I think that's where I said, there isn't a medium alive today that has ever impressed me, not to the standards of those that have died and have been researched. So again, Mrs. Leonard, Mrs. Piper, Eileen Garrett, and several others. There's like only, I can count them probably on one hand, then maybe just a few extra fingers of those that I just thought, wow, that's consistently not just listen to this particular anecdote of what happened with this person I gave a reading to. Is listen to what happened when they were stuck in the lab, they were tied down, and then they got in contact, like with Eileen Garrett, to the pilots of the R101 disaster, and the information that was coming from that. Those are kind of really interesting studies. So I think my interest has always been in not testing the mediums. I've been interested in the Barnum script and the cold reading, because that's what Chris Rowe's PhD was on. He's the only person who seems to have really formally studied that in a scientific manner. My interest with mediums has definitely leaned heavily towards the clinical application. I'm really not overly interested in where it's coming from, though I'm interested in anyone that can do those studies, like Dr. Julie Byshaw. She seems to be the main person for testing mediums. I've leaned into your direction, Carolyn, with what's this doing for people. That has certainly been my kind of stronger interest, because I think we could debate till the cows come home as to, is this Barnum, is it cold reading, is something else going on, and so forth.
We should just probably say that the paper is called Exploring the Effects of Mediumship on Hope, Resilience and Post-Traumatic Growth in the Bereaved. And that's published in the Journal of Exceptional Experiences and Psychology.
Bit of a plug there, well done.
You're allowed to, that's fine.
You can download it from their
Carolyn,
website.
so what actually turned it for you? Because you came from a skeptical background. Was it literally your first reading that you tried to prove that it was all rubbish and actually ended up proving to yourself that there was something there?
Yeah.
I'll just quickly jump in.
Oh, sorry, go on.
I was just going to quickly jump in because I heard Neil's comment in the background there. Yes, if you go to the website of the Journal of Exceptional Experiences in Psychology, you can download that paper and all previous issues of the journal.
Thank you.
Cool.
Yeah. So I ended up at the Spiritualist Church after that, Andrew, for a completely unrelated topic. I still was sceptical, but I saw what I would consider a ghost in my house.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, I'm not dealing with this. I need to go to those spiritualist people, for goodness sake. And that's where I met my mentor. She was the president of Blackburn Spiritualist Temple for 30 years, I think. Mrs. Alice Rimmer, her name was. And she insisted quite strongly that I go and sit with her because I had to train as a medium. And if I didn't do it with her guidance, that it would turn into an ego thing and I'd lose it. And so skeptically I went along and over time started to really realise what was going on, and that's where my beliefs and then my ability, I suppose, sprung from.
And what kind of spurred you on into the psychology direction?
I've always been fascinated by people, and I've also, the way people behave, and so for me, it was quite linked to wanting to know more about behaviour. And then the positive psychology, I did it as a module in my undergraduate degree, and I just really loved it. It really struck a chord. So I wanted to pursue that more, and it's the best thing I ever did, is taking that master's degree in applied positive psychology, because you can't help but come out of it a different person. If there are areas of growth that you need to kind of look at, that's the kind of thing you want to be doing for that to happen.
This is it, because people often go to psychic reading. Some go just for a laugh, and some go to get information. But a lot of people go actually as a form of counselling or therapy or healing of some kind.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is a very good thing to kind of get that behind them.
I was just about to say, in that kind of context, it's for people that are especially helpful for those people that are suffering from a very kind of high impact bereavement, that don't want to give way to going to counselling, because there's a lot of people that still think the admission of going to counselling or something like that, or the psychological intervention, is to say that you have a psychological issue and you have some form of psychosis or something else. But bereavement is that. It's some people have even looked at it as a form of disease when it gets so bad. It's separation anxiety, and it is a kind of post-traumatic stress. You've gone through particular losses, and depending on what they are, can impact you in different ways. And if they don't want to say, well, I don't want to go and see a psychologist or a counsellor, there's nothing wrong with me, here's this more public forum that, yes, people have got their varying opinions on what it is, but there's this sense of community. You can sit at the back, if let's say it's like a spiritualist church, you can sit at the back and just watch other people, or a reading might suddenly come to you, or you can go and do it private one-to-one, and it's not on your medical records or anything like that. You haven't gone to your GP, so it's this alternative option that just people feel a lot more comfortable with. Where it
grieve.
Yeah, go on.
Oh, I was going to say, often it's permission to grieve. It gives people, if they get meaningful contact, they can then feel that they are able to start to grieve the loss.
Yeah, open up.
It often, I find that you could go for weeks and months and months and months of psychological help or counselling with a counsellor, and it doesn't make a dent. But you can have one evening or 1 hour session with a medium, and you can come out feeling like you've just won the lottery. I've had instances like that. I mentioned to Carolyn, I think it was for your paper, Carolyn, I talked to Cal about it over Facebook, about Ross Bartlett, the medium from Southampton. absolutely cracking reading. You know, I arrived there late, and he gave me such evidence that how could you possibly say it was a Barnum statement? He never knew me at all.
And it's fair to say, Neil, you are quite sceptical, even though you have your beliefs.
Yeah, I mean, when people show me photographs of orbs, or you know, this is Grandma's face on my phone or whatever like that, I have to look at it because I look at photographs and things like that, and I know
here's Jesus in a
Photoshop.
piece of toast.
But, yeah, I would just butter all over that one and crunch it. Yeah, you certainly know which way his bread was buttered. So basically. But for instance, if we get back to Ross Bartlett, which I think you listened to the audio recording, didn't you, Carolyn? I played it to you.
I did, yes, yeah.
As part of your study. But he started coming through with names of people I didn't know. And I thought, oh, he's got the wrong person. He came through with a name of, I forget who it was now. But he then said, you can take the name Morgan. And I said, yes, that's right. And now, for those that don't know, Morgan is the name of my daughter. And he said, now, do you see that man over there, the white shirt? And he was pointing to the guy that had showed us in through the door, a man in a white shirt, and he basically directed us to go and sit down somewhere. He goes, I'll go and sit over there, sort of thing. So we said, yeah, we see the man over there with the white shirt. And he says, well, that man over there is called Chris Hayes. Now, as soon as he said that, Chris Hayes, I thought, oh, my God. Now, nobody else knew this in the room, but as soon as he said Chris Hayes, it had a, gulping moment. And he said, they're telling me that Chris Hayes is also a name that is connected with Morgan that I mentioned earlier. And basically, my daughter goes out with a man called Chris Hayes. And you're thinking, how on earth could that be a Barnum statement, or be even, you know, what is the odds of that? You know, a guy called Chris Hayes, and that he's giving me a reading, and he says that Chris Hayes is also the name of your daughter's boyfriend, type of thing, which was absolutely amazing. I was blown away, basically. So, I mean, I don't know if you guys want to comment on that, but I mean, it'd be interesting to see.
Put it this way, Cal, if he was going to fake it, this guy, how would he do it?
He probably. I know Ross really well. He's also based at Bucks-New University doing his PhD under Dr. Matthew Smith. And we've even travelled out to the United States before, where I've been doing my thing, talking to the audience, and he's been doing his thing. And I've seen Ross come out with these impressive statements for names, and also street names as well. And it's probably led to some people's annoyance that it's like on these plane trips over that take some 8 or 9 hours, most people are watching a film. We've chatted the entire way over. And he's certainly at the top of my list of people that are alive and doing this. But certainly I've never seen Ross in formal studies yet, which I would love for him to do, and I know he would certainly say yes to doing them. But he's someone that you would send down the route with the stuff Carolyn was mentioning, where there was lab studies with Matt, people that are interested in testing mediums. I've always known Ross on just a sort of work colleague sort of basis, but I've seen him do this. So you ask if he was doing this fraudulently, how would he do it? He would, I would assume, go on social media, get familiar with people that he knows are going to be at these events where he's actually going to be performing, and then look at people that are there and try and remember different things that are going on. Now, with Carolyn, when I mentioned that I gave her a reading at the Arthur Findlay College, that same day I was snooping her Facebook profile. So I didn't have time to remember stuff, but I went through different things and wrote them all underneath my wristbands. So now and then I could sneak a peek, but then she was wondering where I was getting these specific names and things from. And, you know, stupid me wearing short sleeves, she had a sneak peek what's underneath your wristbands and got to see it written down. But, you know, if you're going, like I did with the Barnum scripts, just practice the night before and get those things stuck in your head and know who you're looking out for. Because it's scary how much people do put on social media and how much stuff isn't locked regarding your personal life or people you're associated with. And so it's so easy.
I did ask Neil about Facebook, but also Neil's brother, who has no Facebook footprint whatsoever, was also mentioned by name. You know, and you'll probably remember, Neil, I was saying, could he have got any of this from Facebook? But he gave you your aunt's name, and you didn't even know that's what she was called. And he told you your brother had been taking rubbings from the gravestone. You knew nothing about that.
That's right. Yeah, he gave a name, and I'll say it's Eva. I can't even remember her name. It shows how much I know, and you know, I wouldn't even put that name on Facebook because it's not a name I knew. But let's say, for example, he gave a name Eva, right? And I said, I'm sorry, I can't take the name Eva. And he says, Eva, who's married to Edward. And I said, I'm sorry, I don't know an Edward. So I thought, no, he's definitely with someone else. But he's, you know, if any other medium who was like fraudulent, would they think, oh, I'll try someone else then? But no, he persevered, he stayed with me. And he said, well, he's saying, Eva's saying to mention Phil because he goes to the graveside, and I thought my brother does go to gravesides and things like that. And so anyway, after all this was over, I asked my mum, she was with us then, and she said no, she didn't know the name Eva because I always say check with your family. And so a few days later, my mum was on the phone to my dad's sister. And she goes, yeah, I know who Eva is. And she goes, well, who is it? And she goes, that's Neil's Auntie Doris. Now, Auntie Doris was a very old auntie of mine. It's my dad's auntie. And she apparently had the middle name of Doris, and her Christian name was Eva. But she never liked the name Eva, so everyone called her Doris. And so I just grew up with the name, believing her real name was Doris. And of course, then it all fell into place afterwards, because I thought, hang on, Auntie Doris was married to Uncle Ted. Ted is the shortened version of Edward, who he said that Eva was married to.
Yeah.
So, you see, and so it was Eva that was bringing us all this information, and it was Eva that said about my daughter Morgan, and he also mentioned, he says they want to mention Russell, and they also want to mention Simon. They're two of my brothers. So, and also, for instance, he gave a reading maybe about 2 or 3 months earlier to my partner Monica, and he said, I want to come to this lady here first of all, and he says, I want to give you the name of Emily, which was the name of her daughter, and I see her working in a supermarket environment, and she was working in a supermarket environment, and I see her in the Bristol area, and that's where she was living, in the Bristol area. So it's like, wow, how did he do that? Was it social media? I mean, you could try and explain social media a little bit for some of it, but the very fact that my daughter Morgan was going out with this guy called, still going out with him, Chris Hayes, and the fact that the other guy in the room was called Chris Hayes, that is a bit of a strange coincidence, I felt.
And I remember asking you distinctly, had you put anything on Facebook that you were going to this event? And you said, no, you hadn't.
Absolutely. And I even made sure that the tickets were purchased, not in my name. It was someone that knew me. He said, I'll just grab you a couple of seats and you know, and you pay up later, sort of thing. So they weren't even booked by credit card or anything like that that could be attributed to me. This person said, I just want 5 seats, please, reserved under my name, the person that was sorting it out, and so we arrived late, and we just perched ourselves in the last available chairs. So it's not if I was sitting in a pre-designated chair that he could then remember, you see.
Yeah, I remember having this conversation with Cal, actually. I don't know if Cal remembers. And I was saying, how do you think that he got that information if Neil didn't even know?
Mm-hmm.
And he hadn't put it on Facebook, and there was nothing to link Neil to that event.
I mean, Neil, were you not associated with that particular place or going there? Had you been there before? Did you actually know anyone there?
No. I mean, there was a guy there called Gary who I was in a psychic developing circle with, and I've been on to Gary for about a year saying, Gary, you've got to get this Ross Bartlett up to do a demo somewhere up this end. So he eventually did. He managed to get him up there. And so Gary let me know, and he said, you'll want me to try and get you some seats or something. I said, I'd love to. So basically we got there. We arrived late because it was a building that I couldn't find. There was actually 4 buildings. They all looked the same. And we had to keep going in each building until we found the right building. Eventually we found it. And of course, that's why we were late. And we got in there. That was shown to the last couple of chairs by the chap in the white shirt who turned out to be called Chris Hayes. And he was doing a reading on the person, and then as soon as he finished that, he then came over to me and he looked and he says, I'd like to come to this gentleman here. And he pointed to me and went, oh, thank you. So I started recording. And then most of the time, he didn't even look at me because he was looking up towards the ceiling and shutting his eyes half the time. So he wasn't even doing body language reading. He wasn't even looking for my responses. He just wanted a yes or no. Can you confirm yes or no? And even when I said, no, I can't take the name either, he still stuck with me. He persisted. And he got it right through. And then he brought through my granddad, who was Welsh, again, not on Facebook, things like that. I mean, I've done readings with like the Ouija board, and had a very successful reading with Heavenly Voices with an Ouija board. They're a team down in Weymouth, and they brought through my mum very uncannily, absolutely spot on messages from my mum. And there was this guy that I was having a kind of debate with on over YouTube over his portrayal of mediums being all kind of fakes, and I said no, they're not, because I've done it myself. And if all mediums were fake, well, either I'm deluding myself because I've got information from people and things like that, so I know that I was having a genuine attempt at doing it, but I wouldn't put myself in Ross Bartlett's position at all in that category. But he said no, they're all fakes, they're all kind of doing it, they're all cold body language reading and things like that. And he said, look, I've just found out about this from you. I've gone to your Facebook profile. He says, I know you work for the BBC and you do this and you do that and you do that. I said, hang on a minute, you've got that totally wrong. I don't work for the BBC. And I said, and all the things you've brought up are things that were never brought up in that reading at all. So if you think they're getting off Facebook, well, why aren't all these obvious things being brought up in the reading when they're not? They were bringing up obscure things that I didn't even know, like the name Eva. I didn't know that. That was my Auntie Doris. How did I know that? That's not even published on Facebook because I didn't know it, you see.
Also, it's quite a gamble on the psychic's part. If a psychic is going to, or let's say a fake medium is going to do that, it's quite a gamble that person's going to turn up. So let's say you're going through you've got a list of people's credit card names and you're going on Facebook and you're seeing them. You've got to memorize for a 2-hour show, probably, I don't know, maybe 10 people, intricate details for 10 separate people, hoping those people are going to turn up, because some might turn up, some might not turn up. And then if you're going to write them, you've only got a certain amount of space on wristbands or wrist or anything. You could do that maybe for one person, but if you've got 10 people through a show, where are you going to start putting it? On your ankle?
I would argue that, if you've practiced, like I said, I wouldn't have written anything down, and it'd be easier to remember some, specific pinpointed details about 10 people than it would be for an actor to do a script of a 2 or 3 hour play. I think it'd be far easier in that kind of instance.
I would say that an actor would have to rehearse the same play again and again and again, whereas a
absolutely
show would have to memorize 10 different people for each show.
But there's less content for those people because you just want some names and some very specific things, not let me tell you what happened in 1977 and I'll tell you the entire year as though it was some sort of 2 or 3 hour monologue. It's just some specific pinpointed things. Go on.
So you'd have to be absolutely spot on with your memory, because what might start happening is some information might start bleeding into other information and you might get mixed up, or the medium.
There's a possibility children's names, so I wouldn't be able to do that.
There's a possibility of that, but I would argue with some training, I think I could replicate that feat. And not to get out of the argument, guys, but I'm going to have to dash at this point. As convenient as it sounds to say, I'm going to go at this point.
Hal, I'm going to challenge you to that. Do it.
When I get the time to do that, I never get the time to do most things.
I want you to do it. I wanted you to prove us wrong.
Well, nice talking to you, Cal.
Yeah, you too, guys.
We'd like to say thank you very, very, very much for taking the time out to chat to us, Cal. We wish you all the best and good luck with your future endeavours and your publications, of course. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much. Hopefully we can take this debate forward. If I speak to you guys again, we can see what happens.
Are you going to take up the challenge?
I'll take up the challenge when I actually have the time to actually do that and the actual right setting. So if I knew that something like that was coming up where I was going to be available, I'd see how well I could actually do by using these false techniques to see how well it matches up against the people that say that they're doing it by legitimate sources.
Okay.
So I would shake your hand on that and say that I'm up for that challenge if and when that arises. But aside from that, I'll just plug myself one more time. So if people want to contact me or look at the books, go to www.callumecooper.com.
Excellent. Thanks.
Great website.
Yes, thank you very much. All right. Take care, guys. Have the debate continues.
Take care, Cal.
Some conclusion. Bye-bye, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. And now, Carolyn, you remember the first time I came to your house because I was doing practice readings, and I did a reading on you for the first time, didn't I? With Paddy, your dog, climbing all over me. And I didn't know much about you, really. I knew that you knew my brother, and that was about it. And you knew my brother's ex-girlfriend, and that was about it. And that was it, really. And then I started going into this whole daydreamy reading for you for about 2 hours or something. And I started talking about things like what was it now? I said I got a Scottish connection with you, and I said I'm specifically talking about Glasgow, and you said yes. And then I said something about, for some reason, I'm seeing a big circus tent. I said, I don't know if you like the circus, but I can see a big circus tent like Billy Smart's circus. I don't know what the connection is there. And you said, yes, I can take that. And I said, can you? Because I disbelieved it. I thought, why? And then you went and showed me a photograph of your dad, who you said was Scottish and came from Glasgow. And you said, here he is. He's a driver and he worked for Billy Smart Circus.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's just a small example. I'm not trying to say I'm fantastic or anything like that, although that was very good.
It was, yeah.
But, you know, for people to say that I'm Barnum reading, cold reading or whatever like this, and you know, I don't know how I could have done that, really. And
how many other people would be able to relate to that? If we took 100 people, I've got 100 friends on Facebook. I guarantee you, I'd be the only one of them, apart from my 2 siblings, who would be able to say, "Oh yes, my dad drove for Billy Smart Circus."
That's
it's
right.
It's not a everyday thing, is it?
No, I mean, I didn't say specifically you drove for Billy Smart. So I said I can
see
a
connection. You said I've got
to a Billy Smart.
You did mention Billy Smart's.
Yeah. So
I mean, how many circuses are there?
That's right. That's right. So there was definitely something happening. I mean, maybe I was in communication with your dad. I can't remember everything now, but I talked about Terry Wogan and Noel Edmonds and things like that. Things that are attributed to you. And, you know, why would I pick out Noel Edmonds? And you said, oh, yeah, I do like Noel Edmonds. I've got a secret crush on him or something, you said.
Yeah.
He's got a bit spiritual now, which is quite nice, hasn't he?
Yes, he has. Yeah.
He had I think it was pancreatic cancer or some kind of cancer, and he got very much into kind of like positive thinking. Again, this positive psychology, and he also had some kind of machine. I can't remember what it was, but some kind of, I don't know, waveform type of machine that he claims cured his cancer.
Well, that's the way forward, apparently.
Yeah,
it's all about waves, isn't it?
Yeah, that and cannabis oil.
He also removed his colourful jumpers.
He did, yeah, and Mr. Blobby.
Yeah, but what about the shirts?
We won't go into that. So, Carolyn, with your peer-reviewed, I forget what you called it, your paper with your, how did you describe it again?
Well, it's that basically. It is a peer-reviewed paper in a journal.
But you said mediumship. I can't remember the title, if you like.
Yeah. Do you want me to read it out to you again?
Yes, please. Yeah.
So it's exploring the effects of mediumship on hope, resilience, and post-traumatic growth in the bereaved.
Okay. And so how was that received by the powers that be at the particular place that it had to be looked at?
Well, I was quite lucky that my dissertation supervisor was Dr. Matthew Smith. And he's the one that I've done the mediumship in the psych lab with. He's the one that Cal also spoke about. And so he's very open-minded. I've yet to find out what kind of feedback it will receive from the parapsychology community, because that'll be in the next journal. And I expect some people will slate it and say it's biased because I'm a medium, and I've said I'm a medium in the paper. But I felt that it wasn't the right thing to hold that back. I felt that information was as pivotal to the research as any other.
Well, that's right. A medium is the tool of getting the job done, and they can be biased saying they're a scientist, and that's how they get their job done, don't they? Really? So you know, all needs are must sort of thing. So
but it's an interesting stance, because people don't quite know what to do with me because of the fact that I profess to be a medium and I'm also a psychologist. It's really, you know, I don't know anybody else really.
It's quite a unique position to be in, because you can at least you can say your crackers with total authenticity, can't you? If you wanted to go that way. But
absolutely.
Yeah, I'm totally crackers because my dead auntie told me I was. Okay. So if people want to find out more about you, if you want to do that, how can they contact you, or how can they find out about the kind of work you've done? I've
got a website for my psychology coaching, which is www.caracox.co.uk. And I guess they could contact me through there. Other than the journal article, which we've already mentioned and said where that can be found, there's probably not a lot else really
You've done some books, though, haven't you? You've
Oh
written
yes,
some books.
yeah. I've got various sort of how-to psychic type books on Amazon.
Right.
So I guess if I give you the title of one, it will lead into
All the
people
others.
want to look
Yeah.
into it. Yeah. So I've got one called Sacred Geometry, Spirit, Crystals, and Chocolate,
Fantastic.
and that's C.J. Baines. Is
I like
my-
the sound of the chocolate.
Yeah.
Yeah, you've always got to ground yourself, Andrew. Always got to ground yourself.
Well, you know what kind of future you're going to get, especially when there's chocolate at the end of it, don't you?
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, it's going to be a very good year for you, especially around Easter time.
I think I'll get away for a little while longer.
Right, I think we're going to have to draw our programme to a close because we've been chatting for well over, good 55, 58, 59 minutes or so. So that's the end of our programme for tonight on the Paranormal Peep Show. So I'd like to say once again thanks to Cal Cooper for joining us and also for Carolyn Cox for coming in the second part. Thank you, Carolyn, for that contribution. And we'll just remains to be seen. We'll catch you guys next month and thanks for listening.
So happy Easter, everyone.
Happy
Thank you.
Easter.
Yeah.
Good night all then. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.